Amanda from Pontes Books here with the fun fact for chapter 10 of The Prince and the Pauper. Today's fun fact is looking at reflexes as related to something that happens in chapter 10 that is a sort of reflex or flinch, I guess you could say, that Tom has when he was growing up. So looking at the reference in The Prince and the Pauper, this is kind of the part where it is explained. So it says, since that day when he was little, that the powder burst in his face, he hath never been startled of a sudden out of his dreams or out of his thinkings, but he hath cast his hand before his eyes, even as he did that day, and not as others would do with the palm inward, but always with the palm turned outward. I have seen it 100 times, and it hath never varied nor ever failed. Yes, I shall soon know now. So this is something where it is Tom's mom trying to create a test that proves once and for all that this is actually her son Tom and not some stranger as he's claiming to be. So she thinks back to his childhood, and apparently there was one day where some powder burst in his face, and ever since then, anytime there was a loud noise or he was startled out of his sleep, he always had this reflex or this flinch where he would put his hand up in front of his eyes like this to protect his eyes. And she's apparently other people would go like this, but he goes with his palm outward. So this is this reflex that he has developed. So we wanted to look a little bit at reflexes. So what are reflexes? They're involuntary. You don't even really have any control over them, although you can increase your reflex time or decrease your reflex time rather by kind of training yourself. But in general, we have reflexes that are just natural and we don't even do anything to create them. So most of them we're born with or develop over time naturally. So a lot of those are related to protective reflexes. So those are, if you touch something hot, you remove your hand right away. Blinking is a protective reflex. Raising your arm if something is thrown at you. So that's kind of related to the one that we talk about with Tom. It's just natural to raise your hand if something is thrown at you to either catch or, bat it away. And so a lot of these start at the muscle or the skin and go to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is kind of the home base for a lot of these reflexes. So what are some of our earliest reflexes? So if we look at infants and we see what are the natural reflexes that most babies have. One of those is a rooting reflex. So that is turning their head and opening their mouth to find a source of milk. So if they feel something kind of like close to their face, on their cheeks, they'll just naturally turn their head and open their mouth to find that source. Then along with that, also to actually get milk, there's a suck reflex. So when the roof of a baby's mouth is touched, that's a reflex for them to just begin to suck. Then we have the Moro reflex, which is kind of the startle reflex. So if there's a loud noise or something that startles a baby, they kind of like put their arms out and I guess shake them a little bit. They're startled. Then we have what's called a tonic neck reflex, which is called a fencing position. And this one was just kind of interesting. So it's if the baby turns their head to one side, I think one arm goes up and the other one kind of like comes in. I don't remember which way it goes, but they kind of like, or it goes out and then the other one like folds in. So they look kind of like a fencer, kind of like doing an on guard pose. And then a grasp reflex. So if something's in the palm of their hand that they grasp it. So I know we all like to think that, it's a cute little baby bonding with us and grabbing our fingers. But it is a little bit of a reflex. And then a stepping reflex. So when you're holding them up off the ground, they, kind of kick their legs like they're walking or they're dancing. So those are some of our earliest reflexes. So related to that, then I wanted to look into kind of like what is flinching, because I feel like this is almost more of a flinch than necessarily a reflex because it wasn't something that Tom was born with. So one of the main studies I found that was based on this is they did a test based on monkeys. And so they discovered that when they had a puff of air blown at their face, that they would, react to that, either like, with an arm up, or, a flinch and blinking of their eyes. And that triggered a polysensory zone in their brain. So they did an initial experiment where they they did this experiment over time. And so they noted that initially there is a reaction to this stimulus, right? This puff of air. But once the monkeys started to expect that this was happening, there's a longer defensive response to try and ward off the threat. So they start to anticipate it, and then they're more defensive as opposed to reactionary to try and prevent this. So this kind of seems like what is happening with Tom, who's actually Edward, but she thinks it's Tom, is that he had this powder burst in his face. So now as a result of that, he has this kind of defensive response to try and stop that from happening in the future. So what they found from this is that this polysensory zone may specialize in reacting to objects that suddenly approach the body, that initial kind of flinch, but there is also a more long-term reaction, I guess, that you can have as well. So that's what I've got for reflexes and for flinching, kind of related to this situation. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good rest of your day.